Welcome back to our next installment of 1918 from, in this case, from imminent victory to sudden catastrophe. We continue our run through World War One and drawing out some salient aspects of what happened in ways that will help hopefully create a kind of narrative pattern that helps you make sense of of the German defeat and revolution in 1918 and 1919, and that will help you um, uh, begin to set the Nazis in context when they arrive in the few lessons. So, we left off at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Excuse me. We talked about why it's important, what the German politicians and diplomats hoped to do, what actually transpired, um, and we left it as being one major aspect of a story which has many different threads to it in 1918. So March 1918, March 3rd, March 21st. So not even 3 weeks later, the German army opens its spring offensives on the Western Front. Now, this usually gets pride of place in terms of the narrative of the First World War and how it ends. And we're going to give a little bit of attention to it here because the actual timing and the pacing and the timeline of these events actually matters in terms of creating expectations on the home front, and among the troops at the front, heading to the front, deserting on their way to the front, heading home from the front. It creates expectations and helps shape the perceptions and shape the realities of countless people as we head toward these decisive days. So, um, let's get to it here, and I'm going to try to be a little more careful with the video. I'm going to put it over here right now. All right, so the German spring offensives. Now you can see here that if you're familiar with World War One maps, then you know exactly what this is. This particular bulge is the first offensive. These limited gains here are the second offensive. They're actually trying to get Hasbrunn here, and they come fairly close, but we'll get to that in a moment. The third offensive here, the fourth offensive, which doesn't do much, the fifth offensive, which doesn't do much. And we have four major army groups: Ruprecht, the Crown Prince, Galwitz, and Albrecht. And against this, we have the Belgian army, we have the British forces, the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force. We have a French Reserve Army Group. We have French Army Group North, East, and the sort of well, I guess center, but it's not. I have to look at the French command structures for that. So, usually, the narrative that you'll often get here is that this is the German army was absolutely brilliant, but they just couldn't overcome. They couldn't overcome the sheer numbers and quantity of equipment. They were outdone. They were overmatched, and this was another valiant, gallant effort, but doomed to failure, and so on and so forth. You don't quite have the same sort of mythologizing that you get with the German army in the Second World War, which we're going to spend some time talking about, especially throughout the World War One, the World War II section, and also after the war itself. But there is a certain amount of romanticism. I mean, we call this sometimes you'll hear this called the Kaiserschlacht, the Emperor's Battle, the Imperial the Imperial Battle. It lends it a little, maybe a touch of romanticism. You hear about assault troops, not storm troops, not Sturmtruppen, Stosstruppen. But a lot of them are wearing the coal scuttle helmets. You can oftentimes tell the World War One helmets from the World War Two ones, because the World War One helmets had they had like a lot of them had the lug nuts here for a visor, which they wound up not really using. Um, So there is a touch of romanticism in a number of accounts of this, certainly more popular accounts. The reality, of course, as always, is I think both more interesting and also more prosaic and commonplace. So from the time of the armistice on the Eastern Front through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, 48 divisions are transferred to the Western Front. Most of those are from Russia, not all of them. This gives the Germans a superiority of 191 divisions to 178 Allied divisions, and those are good numbers. The initial thrust here in this area has over 6,000 guns and 3,000 trench mortars supporting them. I have exact numbers over here. This is taken from Alexander Watson's Ring of Steel. There are 56 elite assault divisions. They are given extra training. They have top priority in terms of the equipment and recruits. There are new manuals created to sort of train everyone in the same doctrine. So, and millions of artillery shells are stockpiled. This is a very serious effort. This shows is a very careful planning. It's a sort of stuff that the British and the French had learned, and it looks like now the Germans are learning how to get this right. Excellent use of deception and surprise. Troops are moved up to the front at night. Artillery batteries are moved up, and they zero in. They get their range by beginning to fire as batteries already at the front fall silent, so the British and the French don't realize there's actually new artillery that's zeroing on them. They just think it's the same batteries that are always there. There's misinformation spread throughout the front, so that the French think the assault's coming in their sector. This is a very well planned operation. Morale is high. There's a wave of strikes in early 1918 in the factories. The troops generally are very supportive of this. The Fifth Army Mail Censor notes that troops are ready to give it their all if through it the longed for peace will be reached. And so Watson describes their morale as being brittle. They're ready to... The troops are ready to expend every last ounce of blood, sweat, and tears if there is an end to the war. And this concern that you see among an awful lot of troops that they want the war over. This is going to be a major factor in how 1918 unfolds. So you'll often hear that the defining element of the war was what's called the Frontgemeinschaft, the soldiers' society at the front, that sort of community, the community you build, the soldiers' community. And you'll have a lot of writers in the post-war period, Ernst Junger being probably the most prominent of these, writing this amazing prose describing the experience of being in this community and being part of it. But if you actually study what we know of the mail and the language being used here, what's the concern of a lot of troops is this sounds great. This will bring an end to the war, right? Because we're about ready to go home. All right, so 4:40 a.m. March 21st, hurricane bombardment throws over 1 million shells into British and French lines, and poison gas, as well as high explosive and rolling artillery barrage. The first wave of assault divisions punched through. The first day, the Germans captured 21,000 prisoners of war, kill over 7,500 Allied troops, and wound 10,000. That's pretty good for the first day. By the end of the offensive, on April 4th, and that's this line here, they captured about 90,000 troops, 1,300 artillery pieces. That's not a bad haul for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of action. The actual full story, however, is somewhat less reassuring if you're the Germans. This nothing of value is captured here. There is no appreciation that the city of Amiens is crucially important in terms of it, being a rail hub, communication network, and so on, and that it would open up the possibilities of actually cutting off the British. Ludendorff doesn't seem Erich Ludendorff, the chief of staff, who's the one who actually draws up and executes a lot of the plans. I mean, Hindenburg is the commander, but Ludendorff is the one who actually does a lot of the planning and execution. Ludendorff doesn't seem to realize Amiens is important. The 17th Army was supposed to make the main effort. They get bogged down. The 18th Army makes a lot of progress. They're supposed to just protect the other army's flank. Ludendorff says, yeah, they're making progress. Let's go with them, even though that doesn't really make sense. This is a well thought over wilderness of low-lying wetlands, shell craters. There's nothing here, and there is the opportunity to strike Amiens. Ludendorff doesn't realize it until March 26th. And that's too late. So they don't really even get close. By the time this offensive is over, the 3 German armies that have partaken in this have lost 240,000 men, and a huge chunk of that's going to be in those elite divisions. This is the first offensive. I mean, Ludendorff sums up his approach as being make a hole and see what happens. And he'd been pressed to define the strategic objectives of this whole operation a bit more closely. And why wouldn't you want that, really? I mean, this is your last strategic reserve. This is your last hurrah. You know the Americans are going to be arriving in force. Now, the Americans, it may take them a long time to train up and get into action, but they're just not. There's a lot of them. If you're going to expend your strategic reserve, shouldn't you at least have a more formal plan? Now, so when we go to the other offensives, number 2, this is Operation Georgette. This is up north. Initially this looks very good. It looks like they're totally overmatching the Allies. There's 10 British and 1 apparently very tired Portuguese division. The goal here is Hasbrunn, which is sort of one of the major British rail logistics hubs. And if they can capture that, that's going to cause huge problems for the Germans. I mean, for the British. However, they have 36. The Germans have 36 divisions going into it. 27 of those had already fought in Operation Michael, and they're exhausted. Because remember, German military is mostly infantry. They don't have the kind of motorized capabilities that the British and the French have. These guys are going to be marching. There are some trucks. If you look at photographs of Operation Michael in the columns, you'll see some trucks. You'll see an awful lot of horse-drawn transport and artillery. You'll see an awful lot of troops just marching. So these divisions are highly depleted and they're exhausted. The rest of them are frontline divisions and they are seriously under strength. And again, Ludendorff cannot actually think clearly about this. Rather than concentrating the opening success on achieving that major objective, he splits the troops up and has some go over here and some go over here, and then some focus on Hasbrunn, and they're stopped. So that offensive fails. The third offensive, again, it's tactically brilliant. Troops are assembled in secret. Again, you have the artillery registering. You have this perfectly orchestrated opening of the offensive. This real estate means nothing. There's nothing of value captured here. Yes, you could say they're within striking distance of Paris, but I mean, not really. It took 3 armies and 250,000 casualties to cover this amount of ground, and there's more distance between that and Paris. You will notice here Cantigny, Chateau Thierry. So we're starting to see the names that are going to be important to sort of American military history in the First World War. The fourth offensive has no success. The Allies have, by this point, as we're getting into June, they've kind of figured out how the Germans operate. And the fifth offensive does very little. The French knew this was coming. They launch an artillery bombardment into German positions right as the offensive's about to jump off. And as you can see, it only lasts for about 3 days, and they call an end to it. The French launched their counteroffensive on July 18th. This is the second Battle of the Marne. Yes, and sorry about that one. I'll skip over this for a moment here to take a look at the second Battle of the Marne. You'll note, so there are 4 French armies. You also notice 5 U.S. divisions. So Chateau Thierry, Belleau Wood. This, the legendary battle of the U.S. Marines. The best book on this is probably by Michael Nyberg at the Army War College. And he draws attention to a number of interesting features of the Second Battle of the Marne. This is this French counteroffensive, July 18th to August 6th. So we're looking at about three weeks. In the first 3 days, and this is going back to Watson here, the French capture 17,000 prisoners of war. There are no trenches in this battle. This battle is orchestrated and fought by the French. It's kind of a showcase of the French ability to use to coordinate infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft. It's really a tour de force in terms of showing how the French have learned from the last 4 years. At the end of it, they've captured about 600 artillery pieces, which of course Germans can't replace. And then within 2 days, so the operations in the Second Battle of the Marne end on August 6th. August 8th, the British swing into action. And this is the Battle of Amiens. So, not only did Ludendorff make this huge mistake in not realizing how important this was, Amiens becomes the jumping off point for the British offensive that's going to begin to spell the beginning of the end for the German military. 30,000 POWs are captured on August 18th, and that's when Ludendorff begins to realize, he has a serious problem here. And so we can see some of these pictures and some of these images. British heavy artillery with, just huge numbers of shells, and these are going to work, unlike a lot of the duds that bedevil British artillery at the Somme in 1916. A column of, I'm going to guess, probably about 1,000 POWs captured at this time, from the Imperial War Museum. So, it's in the aftermath of this. This is what's called the 100 Days Offensives. 100 Days Offensive. So the British go on the offensive, the French go on the offensive, the Americans go on the offensive. So late August, you have the Saint-Mihiel operation. For those of you who are into American military history, this is where Patton is leading the tank units. He's very seriously wounded in this, so he actually is not part of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Meuse-Argonne has received some very good treatment recently. This was, the United States military's, huge climactic battle in World War I. Sedan it's a major objective. If the Americans take that, they're really going to cause problems for much of the rest of the German military. It's also absolutely horrible terrain, and that's one reason why the Americans got this area. Also, it made the most sense to slot the Americans in over here and not try to move aside troops who are actually facing down the Germans already. So, the 100 Days Offensives, continuous operations. This is where the British and the French show that they get modern warfare. They have a lot more tanks, radios, They can aircraft. They can coordinate these things better. They have their own version of assault troops and assault tactics. And although they do also take heavy losses, by the 11th of November, you can see they've pushed the German military back well into Belgium, and in many cases almost completely out of France, though not quite. So let's put this in perspective. March to July, the German spring offensives, the German army suffers 977,555 casualties. In other words, almost all the troops that were brought over as reinforcements, those numbers are casualties. So they've expended their strategic reserve. They have nothing. Their overall strength is down 300,000 troops from their pre-Michael strength. During that same time, 1 million American troops have arrived. Of course, you said they capture 90,000 troops in the opening stages of Michael. The British have replaced those by the time by the time the Operation Michael is over. By August, you have almost 300,000 more Allied infantry than you have German infantry. Even at the start of Michael, the Germans are outnumbered in artillery pieces by 4,500, and that's much greater by the start of the 100 Days Offensives in August. They have 800 more aircraft than the Germans do, and that gets worse as time goes on as well. The Allies also have hundreds of tanks. The Germans, they produce only 20. This is the AV-7, which is this huge box, which has very little mobility, can't do anything remotely like what the British Mark IVs and Mark Vs can do. They also refurbished 25 captured Allied tanks. And just as important, the German army's morale collapses. By May, it's common to have upwards of 20% troops desert. So let's say you're traveling by rail from Cologne. By the time the train arrives at, say, Charleroi, or even gets up to Lille, you have 20% of your men have just deserted along the way. And here's a couple images of the French advancing. This is not in combat. This is not an actual combat picture. You can tell because they wouldn't all be outside the tank. This gives you a sense of what the British tanks actually look like. And so, as the as they approach November, in October, they ask for an armistice. It becomes quickly apparent that if they don't, the German military doesn't end this war soon by getting whatever terms they have, the military might not actually be in existence. When November 11th comes, you can see that there's a whole there's jubilation. So the idea that everyone sort of washed their hands of this horrible conflict that was meaningless, meant nothing, and just basically destroyed a whole generation, that is absolutely not what people, and certainly among the Allies, are feeling on November 11th, 1918. Now, by the time you get to the late 20s, early 30s, there's a different mood setting in, but the feeling in 1918 is the war's over. And of course, notice the subheadline: Revolution spreads over Germany, Kiel mutineers, seize whole navy, red flag flies on Baltic, big guns used in Hamburg. And this is sort of what we're looking at here. Peace, armistice signed, world war is over. End of the war, Germany signs our terms. This is the Evening Standard, London. The British are back at Mons. The U-boats are going to surrender. New York Times, Berlin seized by revolutionaries. New chancellor begs for order. Ousted Kaiser flees to Holland. So, the key thing to remember here is that the German home front, the people at home, are not prepared for this at all. They expect huge victories. They're told that victory is imminent. Church bells ring throughout the land when the first successes of Operation Michael are announced. The mood among the troops is very much that, look, someone blundered somewhere, but can we end this? We need to go home. Right? This is This is not worth it. Now, there's a significant other faction which believes that they were there, they could have won through to victory if only the home front hadn't collapsed, and we need to figure out why that happened, because perhaps we were stabbed in the back. But it's important not to privilege the sort of front society, the front community, and the feeling that victory was there if only we weren't stabbed in the back as the dominant feeling among German troops in October and November 1918, because the data we have suggests that that was not the case. How exactly all of this plays out, however, what is this revolution? That will be our theme for next time.